You know, I have been sitting in airport terminals for the better part of 2 decades, watching the ebb and flow of humanity as they shuffle toward gates. And I have seen a lot of things. I have seen the frantic businessman rip his suit jacket trying to get his carry-on out from under the seat. I have seen the exhausted mother juggling a toddler and a diaper bag while simultaneously trying to find her boarding pass. But a few months back, I witnessed something that genuinely made me stop and think. Something that has stuck with me every single time I have approached a security checkpoint since. I watched a cop, a uniformed law enforcement officer, someone who is supposed to be the embodiment of authority in that space, turn a moment of pure instinctual suspicion into a profound, humbling lesson for himself. And it made me wonder, and I want to ask you this right up front. When was the last time you had a gut feeling about someone that turned out to be completely, utterly wrong, and what did that moment teach you about your own assumptions? I really want you to think about that for a second, and when you have a minute, drop your story in the comments. Because the way we judge people, especially in the high-stress, hyper-vigilant environment of an airport, is something we all deal with, and your experiences might just help someone else see their own blind spots. Stick with me through this, because what I am about to unpack is not just a story about one cop and one traveler. It is a deep dive into the psychology of suspicion, the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, and how a single moment of self-awareness can change the entire trajectory of a professional career, and, honestly, the way we should all look at the world. Let me set the scene for you because the context is everything. I was at a major international airport on the East Coast, the kind of place where the pace is relentless and the stakes feel high for everyone involved. It was a Tuesday afternoon, not peak travel time, but the security line was moving steadily. I had already cleared the TSA checkpoint and was grabbing a coffee near my gate, just people watching, which if you are a traveler like me, you know is one of the best ways to pass the time. Off to the side, near a less trafficked corridor that led to some administrative offices and a few private airline lounges, I noticed a police officer. He was a solid guy, mid-40s probably, with that specific posture that says he has been on the force for a while. He was just standing there, observing. And then I saw who he was watching. A young guy, maybe in his early 20s, was walking down that corridor. He was dressed in a slightly disheveled hoodie, worn-out sneakers, and he had a large, beat-up backpack slung over one shoulder. He was looking around a lot, not in a casual sightseer way, but in a way that read as hypervigilant. He kept glancing over his shoulder, checking the signage, then looking back the way he came. To the casual observer, he looked lost. But to someone trained to spot suspicious behavior, to a cop whose job is to see the potential threat in the anomaly, this kid must have lit up like a beacon. I could see the officer's posture change almost imperceptibly. He shifted his weight, his eyes narrowed slightly, and he began to move, not directly toward the kid, but in a parallel path, cutting off the exit routes while appearing nonchalant. Now this is where I leaned in, metaphorically speaking, because I have studied traveler behavior and the intersection of law enforcement and civilian rights for years, and I know that this is the exact moment where things can go sideways. The officer approached the young man, and even from my distance I could see the kid's face go pale. He was startled, and that initial shock is often misinterpreted by officers as a sign of guilt. I watched them talk for a minute, the officer doing the talking, the kid just nodding, his shoulders hunching up toward his ears. You could feel the anxiety radiating off him. The officer then gestured toward the backpack, the universal sign for, "I need to take a look inside." And here's the part that made my stomach clench. The kid hesitated. He put his hand on the zipper, then pulled it back. He started shaking his head, talking faster, his hands moving in a way that looked defensive. From a training perspective, this is textbook suspicious behavior, evasiveness, nervousness, physical hesitation. The officer's face hardened. He took a step closer, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. I have seen this script play out 100 times, and it almost always ends the same way, with the kid face down on the floor, or at the very least, missing his flight while being detained for questioning. But then, something completely unexpected happened. The officer stopped. He didn't escalate. He took a physical step back. He held up his hands, palms out, in a gesture that was clearly meant to de-escalate. He said something, and the kid responded, and whatever it was, it caused the officer to nod slowly. He pointed to a nearby bench, and they both sat down. For the next 10 minutes, they just talked. The officer did most of the listening. Finally, the kid unzipped his backpack, pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal, and handed it to the officer. The officer flipped through it, reading a few pages here and there, and when he looked up, his entire demeanor had shifted. The hard, professional mask was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like regret, or maybe humility. The kid packed up his bag, and the officer walked him not back toward the security checkpoint, but further down the corridor, toward the airline lounges. He pointed at a door, shook the kid's hand, and then stood there watching as the kid disappeared inside. I was, to put it mildly, baffled. My curiosity was fully ignited. So, being the person I am, I did what any self-respecting aviation researcher and writer would do. I finished my coffee and casually walked over to the officer, who was now leaning against a wall, looking like he had just run a mental marathon. I introduced myself, explained what I did for a living, and asked if he would be willing to talk about what just happened. He looked at me for a long moment, then sighed and said, "You know what? Maybe I need to talk about it." What he told me over the next 20 minutes is the reason I am writing this piece. It is a story that encapsulates everything that is right and everything that is potentially wrong with the way we enforce security in this country. The officer, whose name I will keep confidential for obvious reasons, told me that the young man was a veteran. He was 22 years old, had done a single tour overseas, and had been honorably discharged due to a service-connected disability. The disability was severe anxiety and PTSD. The reason he was looking around so much, the reason he was so hyper-vigilant, wasn't because he was casing the airport for a nefarious plot. It was because he was trapped in a crowd, in a loud, chaotic environment, and he was trying to find a quiet place to calm down before a panic attack consumed him. The reason he was heading toward the administrative corridor was because he knew, from past experience, that those areas were often quieter and less crowded. The airline lounges? He had been invited by a support organization for veterans that had arranged for him to use their facilities during his travel to make the experience less traumatic. The officer told me that when he first approached the kid, he was running on pure pattern recognition. Young male, alone, dressed in a way that didn't scream business traveler, acting nervous, avoiding eye contact. That checklist is drilled into them. It is the foundation of behavioral detection. And when the kid hesitated to open the bag, every alarm bell went off. But the officer, for a reason he still couldn't fully articulate, decided to pause. Instead of demanding the bag, he asked a different question. He asked, "Son, what's really going on here? You look like you're not trying to hide something from me. You look like you're trying to hide from everything else." And that simple change in phrasing, that shift from accusation to observation, broke through the kid's panic. He told the officer about his service, about the PTSD, and about the journal. The journal, as it turned out, was the key. It wasn't a bomb-making manual or a terrorist checklist. It was a detailed, daily account of his struggle to reintegrate into society. It was filled with entries about the noise, the crowds, the triggers, and his desperate attempts to find peace. The officer told me that reading a few pages of that journal was like being hit in the chest with a brick. He saw the world through this kid's eyes for just a moment, and he realized that the suspicious person he was about to detain was actually a person he should be protecting, a person who had already sacrificed more for his country than most people ever would. He saw his own son in that kid's face. He saw the assumptions he had made, the shortcuts his brain had taken, and he realized how close he had come to making a catastrophic error, not in terms of security, but in terms of humanity. This is the part where I have to get a little opinionated, because this story is not an isolated incident. It is a mirror held up to a systemic problem in how we approach security and law enforcement. We have built an entire apparatus designed to detect anomalies, to flag deviations from the norm, and to treat those deviations as potential threats. And on the surface, that makes sense. If someone is acting differently, we want to know why. But the danger, the real and present danger, is that we have allowed the definition of normal to become impossibly narrow. Normal, in the eyes of a tired, overworked cop or TSA agent, often defaults to whatever is familiar to them. It defaults to the business traveler in the suit, the family with the matching luggage, the elderly couple moving slowly. Anything outside that narrow band, the young guy in a hoodie, the person of a certain ethnicity, the traveler with an unconventional hairstyle or visible tattoos, the person who is visibly anxious or distressed, gets flagged. And this is where the law and the training often fails us. Because while the letter of the law says you cannot profile based on race or religion, the practice of behavioral detection is inherently subjective. It relies on the officer's gut, their experience, their biases, and a gut feeling, as this officer so eloquently demonstrated, can be dead wrong. It can be wrong in a way that ruins a person's day, causes them to miss a flight, traumatizes them, or in the worst-case scenario, escalates into a physical confrontation that could have been avoided. The young man in this story was lucky. He encountered an officer who, in a split-second decision, chose curiosity over control. He chose to listen instead of to act. But for every one of those stories, there are dozens, probably hundreds, where the outcome is different. I want to dig into the psychology of that moment because it is fascinating and deeply instructive. The officer told me that what stopped him was a flicker of recognition. He said the kid's eyes weren't the eyes of someone planning an attack. They were the eyes of someone who was lost and scared. He had seen that look before, on the faces of victims, not perpetrators. That split second of reframing, of seeing the person instead of the suspect, is a skill that is incredibly hard to teach. It requires a level of emotional intelligence and self-awareness that goes far beyond standard police training. It requires the ability to question your own instincts, to challenge the very patterns you have been trained to see. And in a high-stakes environment like an airport where the pressure to prevent an attack is immense, that kind of self-questioning can feel like a dangerous luxury. But here is the hard truth, and I want you to really sit with this. The safest airport, the most secure environment, is not the one with the most aggressive policing. It is the one with the most intelligent, thoughtful, and humane policing. When you treat every nervous traveler as a potential criminal, you create an atmosphere of fear and resentment. You make people less likely to cooperate, less likely to report actual suspicious behavior, because they feel like they are in an adversarial relationship with the very people who are supposed to protect them. You also, and this is crucial, blind yourself to the real threats, because the people who actually intend to do harm are often trained to appear calm, to blend in, to look normal. They don't act nervous and fidgety. They act bored. They act like they belong. By focusing all your energy on the people who are visibly struggling, you are taking your eyes off the people who are expertly hiding in plain sight. This brings me to a broader point about travel laws and your rights as a passenger. And this is where a lot of people get confused. You need to understand that in an airport, you are in a unique legal space. It is considered what is called a constitution-free zone in some interpretations, though that is a bit of an oversimplification. The reality is that the courts have granted the government broad latitude to conduct searches and seizures at airports in the interest of public safety. You do not have the same expectation of privacy walking through a security checkpoint that you do in your own home. TSA can ask to see your ID, they can screen your bags, and they can pat you down based on an alarm or even just at random. If a law enforcement officer, like the one in my story, has reasonable suspicion that you are engaged in criminal activity, they can detain you briefly and ask questions. But here's the rub. Reasonable suspicion is a legal term that is often stretched to its breaking point. It is supposed to be more than just a hunch. It requires specific, articulable facts that would lead a reasonable person to suspect a crime is afoot. In practice, those articulable facts can be as flimsy as he was wearing baggy clothes or he looked nervous. And as we just saw, nervousness can mean 1,000 different things that have absolutely nothing to do with criminal intent. So, if you find yourself in a situation where an officer approaches you, what should you do? How do you protect yourself without escalating the situation? This is the practical advice I want to drill into you. First, and this is the hardest part, you have to manage your own physiology. If you are a naturally anxious person, or if you have a condition like the young veteran, being approached by a cop is going to send your heart rate through the roof. That is normal, but you have to try, as much as humanly possible, to project calm, not because you have anything to hide, but because you want to communicate clearly. Take a deep breath, speak slowly, keep your hands visible, preferably out of your pockets. Do not make any sudden movements. If the officer asks to search your bag, you have the right to say no if they do not have a warrant or probable cause, but you need to understand the consequence of that refusal. In an airport, they can detain you until a canine unit arrives, or they can simply refuse to let you proceed to your gate. It is a practical reality that asserting your rights can sometimes lead to a longer, more intrusive encounter. Second, be honest. Do not lie to a federal officer. Lying to them is a crime in itself. If you are nervous because you are scared of flying, say that. If you are lost and confused, say that. If you are a veteran struggling with PTSD, you do not have to disclose your entire medical history, but you can say, "Officer, I have a medical condition that makes crowded places difficult for me. I'm trying to find a quiet spot." That gives them a framework to understand your behavior. It humanizes you. It gives them an off-ramp from the suspicious person script. The officer in my story responded to that exact kind of honesty. The kid didn't just say, "I'm nervous." He gave a reason that the officer could relate to. He opened a door instead of building a wall. Third, and I cannot stress this enough, remember that the person questioning you is a human being. They have good days and bad days. They have biases and blind spots. They have families and worries. They are operating in a system that pushes them to be suspicious, to find the threat. By treating them with a baseline level of respect, even when you are scared or angry, you are more likely to get the same in return. This is not about being a pushover. It is about strategic communication. You want to de-escalate, not escalate. You want to be seen as a person, not a problem. Now let's talk about the officer's perspective for a moment, because understanding their side of the coin is crucial if we want to improve the system. This officer, after his encounter with the veteran, was forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. His training, his instincts, his very way of seeing the world had almost led him to victimize a victim. He told me that for the rest of his shift, he was second-guessing every interaction. He was looking at people differently. He was seeing the exhaustion in the eyes of the single mom, the confusion in the elderly man who couldn't find his gate, the quiet panic in the teenager flying alone for the first time. He realized that for years, he had been looking for the bad guy, and in doing so, he had stopped seeing the people. He had stopped seeing the stories behind the faces. He said something that has stuck with me. He said, "We are taught to trust our gut. But what if your gut is just a collection of every stereotype you've ever absorbed? What if your gut is just prejudice wearing a badge?" That is a powerful question, and it is one that every law enforcement officer, every security agent, and frankly, every single one of us as citizens needs to ask ourselves. We all have gut feelings about people. We all make snap judgments based on appearance, on behavior, on 1,000 tiny cues we process in a split second. The question is, do we have the courage to pause and question those judgments? Do we have the humility to admit that we might be wrong? This brings me to a concept that I have researched extensively in the context of aviation security, and it is called confirmation bias. Once that officer's brain flagged the young man as suspicious, every subsequent behavior, the looking around, the hesitation, the nervousness, was interpreted as further evidence of guilt. The brain was filtering out any information that didn't fit the narrative. The kid's pale face wasn't a sign of fear of flying, it was a sign of getting caught. His looking around wasn't searching for an exit from the crowd, it was searching for an escape from the law. This is how mistakes happen. This is how innocent people end up in handcuffs. Confirmation bias is a powerful, unconscious force, and it takes a monumental act of self-awareness to override it. The officer in my story managed to do that for a few seconds, and it changed everything. What are the real-life consequences of getting this wrong? Well, they are severe and they ripple outward. For the individual who is wrongly detained, it can mean a missed flight, a lost business deal, a ruined vacation, or a lasting trauma that makes them terrified to fly again. It can mean public humiliation. It can mean a record of the encounter that follows them. But the consequences for the system are just as damaging. Every time an innocent person is treated like a suspect, it erodes public trust. It makes people fear the very people who are supposed to protect them. It creates an us versus them mentality that is the exact opposite of the community partnership that effective policing requires. And it diverts resources and attention away from actual threats. If your officers are busy chasing down veterans having panic attacks, who is watching the guy who is too calm, too prepared, too perfect? I remember another case I researched a few years back, a situation that had a much darker outcome than the one I witnessed. It was about a young man, a college student, who was traveling home for the holidays. He was an immigrant, the son of hardworking parents, and he was flying standby on a buddy pass. For those of you who don't know, flying on a buddy pass is a stressful experience. You are at the mercy of the airline, you might not get a seat, and you are often the last to board. This young man was anxious about making the flight. He was pacing near the gate, checking the monitor, checking his watch. A TSA agent noticed him and thought his behavior was suspicious. They called a law enforcement officer. The officer approached, and the young man, already stressed, became even more nervous. He couldn't articulate why he was pacing. He just knew he had to get on that plane. His nervousness was interpreted as evasion. They asked to see his ID. He fumbled for it. They asked about his bag. He stuttered. Long story short, they detained him for hours. They searched his bag, his laptop, his phone. They found nothing. Absolutely nothing. But he missed his flight. He had to call his parents, who had saved for months to get him that ticket, and tell them he wasn't coming home. He was humiliated. He was terrified. He told me later that for years after that, he couldn't go near an airport without feeling physically ill. His entire perception of his adopted country shifted. He went from feeling like a welcomed guest to feeling like a perpetual suspect, all because his anxiety looked to someone else like suspicion. This is the human cost of a system that prioritizes speed and suspicion over understanding and humanity, and it is a cost that we are all paying whether we realize it or not. Every time we accept a little more intrusion in the name of security, every time we nod along when someone says, "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear," we are chipping away at the foundation of a free society. Because the principle of innocent until proven guilty is not just a legal concept, it is a moral one. It is a promise that we will not treat people as criminals without a good reason. And when we abandon that principle because it is easier or faster or because we are scared, we are all diminished. Let me get into the weeds a bit on how the system actually works, because a lot of people have misconceptions. The TSA and airport police are separate entities, but they work closely together. TSA's primary job is to prevent prohibited items from getting onto aircraft. They are focused on the checkpoint. They screen passengers and bags. If they find something, or if they see behavior that concerns them, they can call law enforcement. Airport police or local law enforcement assigned to the airport have full police powers. They can detain, question, and arrest people. They are the ones who handle the behavioral detection piece outside of the immediate screening area. There is a program called SPOT, which stands for Screening of Passengers by Observation Techniques. This is a program where officers are trained to look for specific behavioral indicators that might suggest a person is a threat. Things like excessive sweating, a rapid pulse, which they can sometimes see in the neck, avoiding eye contact, or exhibiting deceptive body language. The problem is that the science behind SPOT has been heavily criticized. The Government Accountability Office has issued multiple reports questioning its effectiveness, noting that the indicators are often subjective and can be interpreted in many ways. In other words, it is a system built on shaky ground. It relies on the very gut feelings that we have already established, can be dangerously flawed. And this is where the story of the cop and the veteran becomes a powerful allegory for the entire system. The officer was using SPOT-like techniques, whether he was formally trained in them or just using common sense. He spotted an anomaly, he investigated, and he was about to act on that initial suspicion. But he stopped. He introduced a variable that the system doesn't account for: genuine, empathetic curiosity. He asked why instead of assuming what. He looked for the story instead of the crime, and what he found was a story that changed his own perspective. So, what is the lesson here for us as travelers? What can we take away from this encounter that will help us navigate the complex, often intimidating world of airport security? I have a few thoughts, and I want you to consider them not as rules, but as tools in your mental travel kit. First, be aware of your own presentation. I am not saying you should dress up to fly. I am one of those people who believes comfort is king. But be aware that if you are wearing clothes that might be considered unusual for the environment, if you are acting in a way that might draw attention, you are more likely to be scrutinized. That is not fair, but it is reality. If you know you are an anxious flyer, give yourself extra time. Get to the gate early. Find a quiet corner. Do things that will help you regulate your own nervous system so that you don't inadvertently look like a threat. Second, if you are approached, remember the power of narrative. The young veteran in my story had a compelling, truthful explanation for his behavior. He was able to articulate it because the officer asked the right question. If you find yourself in that situation, try to provide context. I'm sorry if I look nervous. I'm terrified of flying, and this is really hard for me. I'm traveling alone for the first time, and I'm a little lost. These are not admissions of guilt. They are explanations that can help the officer reframe their perception of you. Third, know your rights, but know the practical limitations of those rights. You have the right to remain silent, but in an airport, remaining silent might prolong the encounter. You have the right to refuse a search, but that might mean you don't get on the plane. It is a balancing act. The most important thing is to stay calm, be polite, and if you feel your rights are being violated, make a note of the officer's name and badge number and deal with it later through official channels. The checkpoint is not the place to have a constitutional debate. Fourth, and this is a bigger one, we need to start having a public conversation about what we want from our security. Do we want a system that is efficient at catching the tiny fraction of people who are actual threats, even if it means treating millions of innocent people as suspects along the way? Or do we want a system that is humane, that respects the dignity of travelers, and that relies on intelligence and investigation rather than on broad, invasive screening and behavioral profiling? This is not a simple question, and there is no easy answer, but it is a conversation we are not having nearly enough. The officer I spoke with that day told me that he went home and hugged his own son a little tighter. He told me that he has started training younger officers differently, emphasizing the importance of de-escalation and perspective-taking. He said, "I used to think my job was to find the bad guys. Now I think my job is to protect the good guys, and sometimes the hardest part is telling the difference." That is wisdom born of a close call. That is the voice of someone who turned a moment of suspicion into a lesson for himself, and in doing so, became a better cop and, I suspect, a better person. As I watched him walk away that afternoon, I thought about all the travelers rushing past, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. They had no idea that a few feet away, a man had just avoided making a terrible mistake. They had no idea that the quiet, seemingly routine security presence they barely noticed was actually a complex human interaction with the power to change lives. And I thought about the young veteran, now safely inside the lounge, probably sipping a cup of coffee and trying to calm his racing heart. He had been seen, he had been heard, he had been treated like a person. That is the kind of airport experience we should all be striving for. Not one that is free of security, because that is neither possible nor desirable, but one where security is intelligent, targeted, and infused with humanity. One where the people in uniform are trained to see us, not just scan us. One where a moment of suspicion can lead to a lesson rather than a tragedy. It is a high bar, I know, but after watching that cop make that choice, I believe it is possible. It requires each of us, whether we are the traveler or the officer, to be willing to pause, to question our assumptions, and to see the person standing in front of us. I want to leave you with this thought, and I want you to really chew on it. The next time you are in an airport, or anywhere really, and you feel that flash of judgment about someone, that quick categorization of them as other or suspicious or different, just pause for a second. Ask yourself, what is the story I am not seeing? What is the explanation I haven't considered? Because the person who looks like a threat might just be someone who needs a little grace, and the person who looks like they have it all together might be the one hiding something. The truth is, you never really know. And that uncertainty, that humility in the face of the unknown, is not a weakness. It is the very foundation of a just and compassionate society. Now, I am really curious to hear from you. Have you ever been wrongly suspected of something at an airport? Have you ever been the person doing the suspecting and realized you were wrong? What happened? How did it change you? Share your stories in the comments. I read them all, and I know this community learns best when we share our experiences. Your story might be the one that helps someone else see their own situation in a new light. So, take a minute, type it out, and let's get this conversation going. Because if there is one thing I have learned from years of studying this stuff, it is that we are all in this together, navigating a complex world, trying to get from point A to point B safely, and hoping that along the way, we are treated with a little bit of understanding. Safe travels, and I will see you in the next one.